As expected, the preliminary report of the Organization of American States Electoral Observer Mission in Dominica repeats a number of long-standing recommendations for electoral reform and points out a number of serious flaws in the voting process that have been carried over for decades. Quote, "It is clear that Dominica cannot proceed to another election under the current rules. It will therefore be essential to have a new electoral framework in place before the next poll," the official report from the EOM OAS read. OAS observers were present at all 156 polling stations in the 15 constituencies where voting took place and monitored ballots being cast, counted, and the issuance of preliminary results. The mission's preliminary report noted a peaceful and orderly process, with polls opening and closing on time and all polling stations being properly supplied with the material and personnel needed to conduct a proper voting exercise. The report concluded that election officials were knowledgeable and performed their duties efficiently and took note of the abnormally low voter turnout. Concerns were raised about some locations lacking proper facilities for the disabled and the elderly, which made the voting process difficult for them. In some instances, poll workers had to bring materials to elderly and disabled voters within the precincts of the polling station to allow them to cast their ballots. The report therefore suggested the polling stations be retrofitted to facilitate voting for those cohorts. The OAS observers also noted that there was no domestic observation of the voting process, which it deems important if the country wants to enhance the transparency of its electoral proceedings. With respect to the reform process, the preliminary report from the OAS mission exhorted Dominica once again to move forward with planned consultations and legislative changes now to ensure that reforms can be enacted before the next general election. The mission confirmed Prime Minister Skerritt's announcement that he had sent correspondence in that regard, saying it had received the Prime Minister's missive on Monday, which committed to consulting stakeholders, including all political parties in the country, on recommendations for electoral reform. The letter also reportedly sought the assistance of the OAS in reviewing the report and draft legislation from Sir Dennis Byron, the retired Chief Justice of the Caribbean Court of Justice, who was appointed as Commissioner on Electoral Reform for Dominica. The OAS mission says it will transmit this letter to the OAS Secretary General Luis Almagro. Some major flaws with Dominica's voting process were again enumerated by the preliminary report from the OAS election observers. The country still does not have any form of voter ID. There is no mechanism at polling stations to help the presiding officers determine whether voters are who they say they are, with identification of voters heavily dependent on the personal knowledge of presiding officers and poll clerks. Adding to the confusion, there were several instances where voters with the same names and demographic information were listed at the same polling stations. The OAS recommends that the House of Assembly Elections Act be amended to give the Electoral Commission the authority to collect and use electors' data, including their photos and fingerprints, for identification purposes. It further recommends, as it has previously, that picture ID be provided to assist with the identification process. The Elections Act also does not require that voters have their fingers inspected for the presence of electoral ink before they cast their ballots. This security hole also needs to be patched by an amendment to the legislation, and said amendments should also include instructions as to how and when the electoral ink is applied, the OAS observers recommended. Other recommendations include the development of a training syllabus for election day workers and ensuring that workers are selected only after successful completion of that training to ensure only properly trained people are enlisted to work on election day. To achieve an accurate voter registry in the country, the mission recommended that the Registration of Electors Act be amended to mandate periodic updates to the voters list. It further recommended registration forms be redesigned to capture relevant demographic information from applicants and voters. A way to work with the civil registry in removing deceased electors from the voters list was another recommendation carried forward from previous reports following earlier elections. Also carried forward was the recommendation that the Registration of Electors Act and regulations be amended to equip the Chief Elections Officer with procedures to follow regarding voters who have lived outside the country for more than 5 years. The mission noted that poll workers responsible for verifying poll totals and preliminary results were still verbally transmitting that information by telephone to the Electoral Office before results were tabulated. The report therefore recommended, once again, the use of technology through a computerized results transmission system to ensure accuracy and security of preliminary results.